everybody. How are you doing? Good. How are you doing? All right. More than him in the front here. My name is Carrie Wise. As he mentioned, I work for TrueCar and had the pleasure. I feel like I discovered Charlie in some ways when he worked at J.D. Power. But thank you so much for having me, Tim Jackson, and the Colorado Auto Dealer Association. This is my second year speaking at the event, and it's always a highlight for mine of all the different conferences that I speak at. I've been in the industry for about 20 years, and as I mentioned, my second year speaking here. And I was crazy enough about 2.5 years ago to take a job at TrueCar. And I say that because I was working at Edmunds in a different role and was recruited by TrueCar. My husband worked at a store that wasn't particularly fond of TrueCar. And after turning the job down for about 6 months, I finally gave in to take a dealer relations role at TrueCar under our previous leadership. So pretty insane, but it's been an awesome journey for me to watch and be a part of really the evolution of the company under our new leader, Chip Perry, and really see some of the things we've changed to make the company a much more dealer-friendly company. So I have to get that out first. I'm going to talk to you about closing the trust gap in the trade-in process and how we can use transparency to really help build and ultimately lead to profitability. And so before I begin, just a little background in terms of where this information is going to come from. Most people don't realize that beyond TrueCar.com, we power about 500 different sites, USA, Sam's Club, ARP, and we learn a lot about the consumer from beginning to end in terms of their path and how they shop for a vehicle across all of these different platforms. But most importantly, we learn about our dealers. We learn a lot about how they organize the process for these different types of consumers. Because after all, a military consumer is much different than a consumer that's retired. It's much different than an employee from one of our employee buying services. So we'll learn a lot by watching both consumers and dealers and how they interact. And traditionally, we've done that for the new and used car process. We're able to look at our leads all the way down to a sale and understand what best practices dealers are using to help them close more sales. But recently, we introduced a trade product that really opened up the door to understand not only the best practices in the new and used car process, but what are the best practices when it comes to the trade? And how are the best dealers using transparency in their process to not only capture more trade-ins, but do it in a profitable way? And so what I want to share with you is not only the dealer best practices that we're learning in introducing this new product, but also from a consumer standpoint, we're doing extensive research with trade consumers to understand their pain points in the process, including survey research and having them keep diaries of all the steps they take when it comes to selling their vehicle. So let's jump in right into it. And one of the things when we survey consumers and we talk about trust, what type of information do you trust when it comes to dealers? And as you can see, that there really is a trust gap that is still exists in the industry. Now, much of this is perception, right? Consumers bought a car 7 years ago, 10 years ago, and maybe they had a bad experience that carries into their perception of their interactions with the dealer today. But some of it is the disconnects in the process. When we ask consumers what information do they trust, about 3/4 of them say they trust vehicle information, right? I can get all kinds of detailed information from the OEM site to the dealer site to third-party sites. But really where the breakdown comes when we talk about anything related to financing, pricing, and it's particularly evident when it comes to trade-in value. Only 1/3 of consumers say they trust the value of their trade or their appraisal from a dealer. So there's a significant opportunity when it comes to building trust as it relates to the trade-in values. Now, why do consumers distrust trade beyond the perception they may have had in the past? Well, the reality is that when we look at today's consumer, they have an emotional attachment to their vehicle, as you guys know. Everybody thinks that their car is worth more than it is. They think their car is better than what it is. No one thinks their baby is ugly. And when you look at recent research, you can see that 70% of consumers are attached, they say they're attached to their vehicle. A third say that they think their vehicle as an old friend. Half assign a gender to their vehicle. Another third name their vehicle, and you can see a third say they want their vehicle, if they sell it, to go to a good home, and I can completely relate to that. I drove a Honda Accord 12 for 13 years. And because I've worked in this industry, I got so much pressure, every promotion I got. People are like, why are you still driving that car? And the reality is, I loved it. I know it was a boring car, it was an A to B, but I loved the car. And so one day I fell into the pressure and I decided to sell it. And I refused to sell it to a dealership. I wanted to go to someone who really, really deserved it. And one day a coworker had a son that was going off to college here in Colorado. And I said, you know, I gave him the car for $1,000 less than what I could have made it. So I sold the car, and within a month he totaled the car. And they sent me a picture of my baby just crashed. It's terrible. And so I had an emotional response to a car despite my new Lexus that I was driving. So we all have that emotional attachment to our vehicles, and that plays into our perception of the fairness of the appraisal of our vehicles. But another reason for the distress is the disconnects in the process. And when we talk to consumers, what you're seeing on the left side are diaries from consumers, where they track their experiences over 4 months of shopping for a car. And also we're gathering input from consumers that are selling their vehicle. And you can see there's really 5 categories when we define their pain points in the process. It falls into these 5. So number 1, the online disconnect. A lot of consumers express frustration between their experience that they have on information they have online and the inconsistency of that information, or their perception at least, when they're in the store. And that's particularly true on trade. Many consumers are using third-party sites for their trade-in values. And the reality is everyone in the store aware necessarily of the widgets on the dealer's site, information the consumers are using, and is when they're in the store. Sales pressure. So we see that obviously on the sales side, but from a trade-in standpoint, we're finding that consumers sometimes only want to discuss their trade. They're not necessarily wanting to talk about a new car right away. And so we see a lot of pressure to move them and try to close them on a sale. Time. You heard speakers talk about it earlier. Convenience is everything. Consumers want to make the best use of their time. Transparency certainly has come up in terms of the information and really understanding how a dealer came to the value of their trade. And then validation. At the end of the day, you can be as transparent as possible. But if consumers don't have a benchmark or some type of validation that they have a fair value, it doesn't really matter. And so we certainly heard that from consumers. So these are the pain points and the disconnects in the process that really feed into the consumer's distrust. So as a result, what we find is that they're seeking independent validation. And there's really a love-hate relationship. I know that in working with third parties, a love-hate relationship between third parties and dealers. Reality is you probably wish we weren't here and that we wouldn't get in between you and the customer, but we're finding from a consumer behavior standpoint, when it comes to this level of distrust, they're trying to seek some outside type information. And you can see about 3/4 of them, according to J.D. Power, when it comes to their trade-in values, are using third parties. About 1/4 of them are using dealer websites. Many of you, how many of you have widgets on your website from third parties? How many are in the room? Okay, only a few, so not as many. But 1/4 of them are actually going to the dealership website. Another trend that we see when it comes to the consumer is many of them are opting to really decouple the trade from the purchase. In their mind, they could get a better value if they can separate those two. And you look at most consumer advice columns, they're pushing for that, right? Don't mention that you have a trade. Deal with the car first and then mention that after. And we're finding consumers moving in that direction. So a lot of kind of negative information there in terms of the consumer perception, but the reality is that when we look at this world of disruption, this is an opportunity. Because at the end of the day, when we look at the brands that are most successful, they're the brands that were able to solve consumer pain points directly. And so there's a real opportunity, particularly when it comes to the trade. There's a real frontier, a new frontier, to really go and directly solve some of those consumer pain points in the process, make it more easy and convenient for the consumer. And the dealers that can take that on are going to have a real opportunity to differentiate themselves from the crowd. And so I want to talk about some key best practices, some that we've learned from dealers that have done it particularly well, and have used transparency to build trust, credibility, and ultimately are able to maintain profitability, because I think that's important. What we don't want to preach is, oh, give the consumer all the information, give them everything they want, and as a dealer, I'm not making any money. Certainly you're a business, and that has to be a part of the equation as well. And so I want to cover a couple of key things that are important when we talk about building trust in the process. And the first one is the disconnect between the online and offline. It's something that we saw when it came to the consumer pain points, a real pain point that we saw consumers mention. And so I think when it comes to the trade-in process, it's important that we have digital parity across all channels. Right? So some of you are working with third-party trade tools. And so a consumer may be gathering information on one of those third-party trade tools. Now, the question is, do you have that dealership website? So if I go to your dealership website, am I going to see consistent information on the dealership website? And what about when I'm in your showroom and I want you to appraise my car? Are you going to introduce similar tools that tie in my experience that I had at home or on your dealership website or in the store? And really a last step, really, when I think about digital parity, is really in our response. What we try to talk about is it's important to build your own brand as a dealer, right? It certainly shouldn't be about leading with a third-party website. But if you're connected with a website that the consumer trusted, by all means, take that to your advantage. So use that in your response and make sure that it completely ties in every single step, from upper funnel all the way down to the lower funnel for the consumer. So digital parity is a must, and I think this is a big disconnect, not only in the trade process, but we typically see it on the sales side as well. So this is a little wordy, but I think another opportunity to build trust in the process is giving the consumer the ability and the option to have a specific offer on their individual vehicle and do that online. And that sounds insane, like there's so many factors in their condition. But you just think about even the new car and used car process years ago. 20 years ago, I could never call a dealership and actually get a price over the phone. Would never, ever happen. Today, we've now moved along where I can actually get an upfront price from home. When you think about the trade-in process, there's a lot of opportunity there in the same vein. This is a consumer that wrote a review that I just captured. They wrote this review 4 months ago. It was on a consumer-facing article on how to get a fair price on your trade. And what it shows is that there's a lot of skepticism from some consumers on even the changes, right? It might work. Every consumer is different, and we have to offer different paths in terms of the trade-in process. Some are willing to come down to the store, and they don't need anything before they come down. They'll come down and get a trade-in value. Others are fine with getting a range, right? That's good enough for me to feel comfortable with the value. But others are looking for something more specific and are skeptical of a range. This consumer said, looking up trade-in values on a website does no good. They are not appraising your car. They are giving you a roundabout number that could possibly maybe be what your car's worth. The best way to get a good trade-in value is to take your car to another dealer or CarMax or get the value that they would give for it. Then bring that paper to the dealer. Don't disclose to this dealer that you intend to purchase a vehicle from them. Once they appraise your vehicle, tell them what your market value is, then pull the quote out and let them know, ask them if they can match it, basically. 9 times out of 10, they'll match it. So consumers are conditioned to play this game. I mean, by the way, that sounds painful. I mean, you're going to go to another dealership and CarMax to get this value and then play that game and hide it. And you guys know it. We all say, like, the saying, buyers are liars. They'll play games as well. But the question is there a better way? Is there a better way to satisfy this particular consumer? And can we give him a conditional value, assuming that he does the work to give us the information on his car? And so that's a big condition, is that if the consumer is willing to give us their information online, would we be willing to give them a more specific value? Conditional, obviously, on us actually inspecting their car. I think for a certain segment of consumers, this is a way for you to gather incremental trades. To not have that consumer go to CarMax, to not have that consumer go to another dealer because you were able to satisfy them and give them an upfront offer. So when it comes to the actual response, and like I said, through our product, we're mystery shopping dealers. We're learning how they are responding to trade-specific leads. A lead where a consumer has a trade, they're looking to sell their vehicle. And one of the things that we see that typically is a stumbling block is that the person responding to that lead might have a sales commission. Their focus is selling a new car. They're responding to that lead, and instead of addressing the trade, they're going right in for the close, right? You're looking to trade in your car. Hey, we have a big inventory. What car are you looking to buy? And they're not addressing the actual details of the trade. And so what we see that tends to work better from a closing standpoint and a capture standpoint is really starting first with the trade. Not jumping to selling a vehicle first, addressing their issues with the trade, addressing the details of their trade lead, showing your excitement in actually acquiring their vehicle. Remember the emotional attachment. I want to sell my car to someone who deserves it. And then also emphasizing that there's not an obligation to necessarily buy a car. Now the reality is that half the people that end up trading in a car will end up buying something else. So there's an opportunity, but we're trying to neutralize consumers' distrust. We're trying to neutralize that perception, and making it hassle-free is one key way to do that. The other question I ask is, what is our value? A consumer has an upfront value on their trade. What is the value for them to come in for that appointment? And I think it's important for us to have those key value props established. These are a couple examples from Real Dealers' websites. You can see that the first one talks about, the one on the left side, talks about how quick and easy it is. The fact that you won't need to wait around for hours to get a trade. It's going to be in a matter of minutes. The fact that, trade value, the no hassle, right? There's no obligation to actually purchase another car. And the fact that they have personal expert appraisers. You can see on the right side, they talk about you'll get a check for your vehicle within 30 minutes. But I think what's important is they don't make that empty promise, like, oh, we'll get you in and out in 30 minutes. You can see on the right side, they really established what the consumer needs to do to get this level of service. If you want self-service at that gas station, this is what you're going to need to do. These are the documents you're going to have to bring in to get that level of service. Here's just another example when we talk about selling the value of interacting. Why should the consumer trade their car in with you? It's also important for us to establish why should they trade it in with you versus selling it on their own. And this dealership does a really good job. I've highlighted a few. And they're using scare tactics in some ways of helping the consumer understand why it's going to be easier to sell the car with them. Right? No meeting with strangers at your home. No hassles with the DMV. No phone calls after the sale. Right? We might think of selling on our own, we'll make more, but man, those are the kind of things the average consumer's not thinking about. It's much easier to trade your car in with the dealership. And this is a real innovative value prop, but this dealership actually has a profit-sharing program on their trades. If you trade your car with them, they'll give you an upfront value. If they sell the vehicle, they'll share half of their profit with you. Sounds crazy, but they call it you see the profit TrueWorth shares program. This is TrueWorth Auto in Indianapolis. Now, the key thing is the consumer actually pays for the reconditioning and the marketing of the vehicle. On average, they're paying about $800 up front to be a part of this program. But they're involving the consumer, giving some level of control back to the consumer. When we talk to the ownership of this dealership, they tell us that their margins are great. It's a frictionless environment. Consumers feel like they're part of it, and they actually are able to actually capture about 70% of trades, and consumers are giving it to them really at a lower cost than they typically would get a trade. So a frictionless environment. Looks like my thing has gone off here. And then the last thing I want to emphasize is helping the consumer understand the why. So when we think about TurboTax, right, the great thing about TurboTax, and I think one of the speakers mentioned it earlier, is that I can put all my information, my W-2s, my personal information, and I'm seeing my refund or what I owe as I go. It's in real time. So when I put my second kid in and all of a sudden I owe less, I know why I owe less. When you think about the vehicle appraisal process, it's a lot of times kind of behind the screen. The consumer's not always aware of how you got to that value. Imagine if TurboTax was like a typical vehicle appraisal process. I do all that work and then you get value at the end. When I owe $5,000 to the government, I don't care what your rationale is, I'm questioning you because I don't know how exactly you got to that value on my baby. And so the question is, or can we provide a TurboTax style of transparency when it comes to the appraisal process? And so a couple examples you see in this condition report is that it's important to avoid that silent walk around by breaking down the value impacting details that affects the actual value of the vehicle, right? It might be that leather increases the price by $450, and it might be that sunroof increases the price. It might be that the mileage is $1,000 less. But thinking about all of these things that are all in our head and part of value, if we can somehow break that down for the consumer so that they have a better understanding of how we actually got to the value, the things that were negative against the value, the things that were positive towards the value, I think consumers will be much more likely to have a higher level of trust, and it'll be a much more frictionless experience. And lastly, involve the consumer in the experience. What we find in surveying our consumers and looking at the outcome is that shoppers who received a side-by-side appraisal with the salesperson were 2 times more likely to actually sell or trade their vehicle to that dealership. So we see it not just from a customer satisfaction standpoint, but in terms of an actual capture rate. So in the end, transparency can be a very negative word in our industry, but it's also where consumers are going and a huge opportunity for dealers that are willing to embrace it. You can be transparent and profitable. It might look different than it looks today. Right now, you might get one of those trades and get a lot of profit off of one individual. Maybe the trade comes down on each individual trade. I mean, the value comes down on each individual trade, but we're able to capture more in terms of volume. And we're able to do it in a much more efficient and at a lower cost to market. And that's what we're seeing as some of the benefits to our dealers that are really embracing this high level of transparency and detail and accuracy when it comes to the consumer experience on the trade. Just want to leave you with this. We work in a very competitive industry, and everything I hear is how we can beat our competition. But to beat the competition, we have to set our sights, and that's spelled wrong, on the consumer. We have to set our sights on the consumer. I love Steve Bezos' quote. If you're competitor focused, you have to wait until there's a competitor doing something before you. Being customer focused allows you to be more pioneering. And so I challenge us today, how can we make that the trade-in appraisal process more transparent? How can we think outside the box and not what we've done in the past, really to offer a consumer a better experience and ultimately to find new ways to be more profitable? So thank you so much. I appreciate your guys' time. This is my email if you want to reach out to me.
Thanks, Carrie. Appreciate it. And it's so fun to see you up here. And yes, thank you for discovering me because I was lost. And what's interesting for me, again, just as a background, as the editor of Kelley Blue Book for 20 years, is just how this process is alleged to be scientific, and the consumers think it's some government control somewhere that says what their car is worth. And we all know not only is every car worth different, but it's worth different to any one of you. If you're an urban dealer with a truck driving in, it's not as valuable to you if you're out in Delta or something like that, or other ways around. And we all know that and I think that's a transparent message to make sure that the customers understand again, every car isn't worth the same because of the condition, et cetera, but also it's not always worth the same to, you know, that car may not be worth anything to me if again, I'm out in Delta and
Yeah,
and
the
it's-
demand. in
yeah,
market.
the Jaguar and things like that. But
Absolutely.
for the transaction to happen, you got to help them out. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank
Good
you
to see
guys.
Yeah.